Welcome back. Now, we'd like to have a blood particle system that gets spawned when the enemy hits the character. So we'll need a blood particle system. So go ahead and go to the GitHub page for this series. The link will be in the resources. And go to UE4 Shooter Series /assets/effects and download bloodspurt.zip. So once you've downloaded this zip file, you're going to want to extract those files. And once you've done so, open up that Bloodspurt folder and you'll see a content folder. And inside of that, there are several other folders, including this Effectsville's Blood Effects pack. Now we need to take this folder and copy it into our project. So here in our project, right-click on the content folder here in the content browser and click Show in Explorer. So now we have our content folder open here. Now we're going to take that folder that we just extracted and take this Effectsville's Blood VFX pack, copy it, and paste it right here in our content folder for the shooter game. Now if we go back into our project, we should see this Effectsville's Blood VFX pack, open the particles folder, and we have this PS Bloodspurt 02. Double click on that, and we have this Bloodspurt particle system. We can use this in our game. So let's go ahead and close out of that. Click Save All. So now that we have a blood particle system, we can set this up so we can spawn particles when the enemy hits the character. So let's go back into our project in Visual Studio and go to shooterCharacter.h, and we're going to add a private variable to the shooter character. So we're going to add a uParticle system pointer, and we're going to call this blood particles. Now we can give this a U property and make it edit anywhere, blueprint read write, and category combat, meta allow private access equals true. So let's go ahead and complete that U property, and let's give this a comment and say blood splatter particles for melee hit. Now we're going to want to spawn these when we get hit by the enemy, which means we're going to need a public getter for blood particles. So let's scroll down to the very bottom and add a getter for blood particles. So this is going to be force inline. It's going to return a uParticle system pointer, and we'll call this get blood particles. It's going to be const, and it's going to return blood particles. Now we have a getter for this particle system, and we can spawn a particle system when the enemy hits the character. Now we need to know where to spawn the particle system, and the enemy has sockets on its skeleton. Let's go ahead and take a look at the enemy skeleton for Grux. Let's go to Characters, Heroes, Grux, Meshes, and Grux Skeleton, and let's take a look at the weapons again. We have Weapon L and Weapon R. Now there are sockets attached to Weapon L and Weapon R. One of them is Effects Trail L01. And we also have one on the right weapon as well. And this is a good spot to spawn blood particles when we hit the character. So we're going to need this socket name, but if we're using a different mesh for our enemy class, this socket name might be different. So we're going to want to have a couple of fname variables for these socket names for the weapons, just in case we have a new enemy with a different mesh that has different socket names for the weapons. So let's go back into enemy.h and let's add a couple of private variables for the left and right weapon socket names. So let's go down here and create an fname called left weapon socket, and we'll make this edit anywhere, blueprint read write, same as base damage. So let's copy the U property for base damage and use it here for left weapon socket. Now let's copy this entire variable, U property and all, and paste it here and rename it right weapon socket. So now we have left and right weapon sockets. Now we can give these default values in the constructor of enemy. So let's go up to the top, and we're going to say for the left weapon socket, we're going to use the text macro. And for the value, let's take a look at this weapon L, and we see here that the socket is called effects trail L01 with underscores. I'm going to copy that socket name, and I'm going to go back in and give our left weapon socket that value effects trail L01. Now we also have a right weapon socket, and I'm going to initialize this using the text macro. And for that, I'm going to go in here and find weapon R. And for weapon R, we have effects trail R01. I'm going to copy that socket name and come back in here and paste that to initialize right weapon socket with this value. So now we have two fname variables that we can use that contain the socket names for those sockets at the end of the weapons. Now we're ready to go into our enemy's overlap functions and spawn some particles. So let's go into left weapon overlap. Now here we have on left weapon overlap and on right weapon overlap. Now we can go ahead and spawn some particles here. And if we're going to access those particles from the character, then we need to take our other actor and cast it to character. But we already do that in do damage, so it would be redundant and inefficient to just cast to the character here in these overlap functions, and then call do damage and cast yet again. So we can do the cast in our overlap functions and then pass in a pointer to shooter character into do damage, and then we don't have to cast here in do damage. So let's take our do damage function and change it so that it takes a shooter character rather than an actor. So here in enemy.h, I'm going to go to do damage, and instead of a actor, I'm going to change this to a shooter character. Now, because this is the first and only time we're using a shooter character here in enemy.h, we have to forward declare this so we don't have to include shooter character.h here in the enemy header file. Now in enemy.cpp, I'm going to go up to do damage and change the signature here to a shooter character as well. Now we still want to check to see if it's null, so I'm going to leave that line here. But we don't need to do the cast anymore. All we need is the code inside this if check for if character. So I'm going to copy it, and just under this if victim equals null, I'm going to paste that code, and then I'm going to delete the cast to character, and I'm going to delete this if character check. And all that should be left here in do damage is our call to apply damage and our play sound at location. Now we're using this character local variable, which we just deleted. Instead, we just need to use victim. So here in apply damage, we're going to replace character with victim. And here in the if check, if character get melee impact sound, we're going to change that to if victim get melee impact sound. And then when we're playing the sound, we're going to change this to victim get melee sound. And here for play sound at location, we're going to use victim get melee impact sound as well. So now we're not even casting here in do damage. We're simply checking to see if that input parameter is null and then calling apply damage on it and play sound at location because it's an A shooter character. Now we can do the cast here in on left weapon overlap. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to say auto character equals cast to a shooter character, and we're going to cast other actor. And we're going to check to make sure character is valid, and if so, then we'll call do damage, and we'll pass in character. Since do damage now takes a shooter character instead of an actor. Now, why did we go through all this trouble? Well, that's because we need to have a reference to the shooter character if we're going to get that character's particle system so we can play it. So here, just after do damage, we're going to spawn the particle system, and we need to know a location to spawn it at. For that, we're going to get the socket location for the socket at the tip of the weapon. And in this function, we're going to get the tip of the left weapon. Now remember, here in enemy, we created two F names, which are the names of the left and right sockets at the tip of the weapons. So we need to get the skeletal mesh socket at the tip of the weapon. I'm going to create a const uSkeletal mesh socket pointer called tip socket. And we can get this from our mesh. So let's call get mesh. And from the mesh, we're going to call a function called getSocketByName. Now getSocketByName requires an F name, and we have these two F names, left weapon socket and right weapon socket. So for this function, we're going to pass in left weapon socket. And now we have a uSkeletal mesh socket called tip socket for the left weapon. Now next we can check to make sure this is valid. So if tip socket, then we can get the transform of the socket. And we're going to store that in a local F transform. So I'm going to make a const F transform called socket transform. And I'll initialize this with the transform of our tip socket. So we're going to get tip socket, and I'm going to call get socket transform. Now we're getting pointer to incomplete class type not allowed. So we need to include the header for uSkeletal mesh socket. Now recall that we use uSkeletal mesh socket in shooterCharacter.cpp. So here in shooterCharacter.cpp, we can copy this include line. It's engine/skeletalmeshsocket.h. Let's go back to enemy.cpp up at the top and paste that in. So now we have skeletalmeshsocket.h. Okay, so we have our tip socket. We're calling getSocketTransform, and getSocketTransform requires a skeletal mesh. So we need to pass in getMesh. And now we have our socket transform. Now we can actually spawn the particle system, but we need to check to make sure that that particle system isn't null. So we're going to check to see if character get blood particles. And if that doesn't return a null pointer, then we know we can access those particles. So we can use uGameplay statics spawn emitter at location. Now the first parameter is a world, so we're going to pass in get world. Next we need the particle system, and that's going to be character get blood particles. Now next we need a transform, and that's why we got our socket transform. So we're going to pass in socket transform, and we can leave the rest of these parameters to their default values. So we're spawning a particle system here at the socket location of the tip of the left weapon because we're getting the transform of that socket. Now we can abstract this away into a function that simply takes a character, just like do damage. So let's go ahead and create a function here in enemy.h. We'll call this void spawn blood, and this will take an A shooter character, and we could call this victim as well. Now, in addition to the shooter character, we also need an F name for the socket which we'd like to spawn blood at. So I'm going to add an F name to this as a second parameter and call this socket name. Now let's go ahead and create a function body for this. Now in spawn blood, we can simply copy the code we just created here in onLeftWeapon overlap. So let's copy it and delete it and paste it right here in spawn blood. Now, instead of character here, we're going to use the victim input parameter. So we're checking if victim get blood particles, then we're spawning an emitter using victim get blood particles instead of character. And also, we're using the left weapon socket in getSocketByName, but now we have a function that takes a socket name input parameter. We're going to simply pass that in to getSocketByName instead. So now we have a nice function we can call to spawn these particles, and it simply takes the character and the socket name. So we can call this here in onLeftWeapon overlap. So we're going to go ahead and call it just after do damage. So let's call spawn blood, And for the shooter character, we're going to pass in character. And for the socket name, we're going to use left weapon socket. Now let's go ahead and copy all this code and paste it right here in on right weapon overlap. Now the only difference here is when we call spawn blood, we need to use the right weapon socket. Okay, perfect. Let's compile this. Okay, so we're back in the editor and we just need to go into our character. So let's go to _game character and let's open shooter character BP and let's go to our blood particles and set this to PS blood spurt 02 and compile and save that. So we can hit play and let the enemy attack us and let's see if we get some blood. And there's the blood. Excellent. That is looking great. Okay, that's going to conclude this video. We now have blood being spawned when the enemy hits the character. We'll continue with our combat mechanics in the next video. I'll see you then.